Welcome, everyone. I hope we're all audible for this very special event, really, which is a reunion of sorts between people who were involved in what was one of the most significant legal battles, I think we can say, of this century so far. It is 25 years ago this month that we saw the end of a trial that had got worldwide attention, David Irving versus Penguin Books and Deborah Lipstadt. Everyone on stage has a connection to that case, and I'll just briefly introduce them before we all get stuck in. On my immediate left is the historian, and until 3 months ago, the special envoy on global anti-Semitism under Joe Biden, and the defendant in this case. A warm welcome for Deborah Lipstadt. Because this is their place of work, it's slightly weird for me to welcome them, but the two lawyers in the case, Julius and James Libson. And completing our panel up here, the man who distilled this extraordinary saga into the acclaimed film Denial, writing the screenplay for that movie, Sir David Hare. And my connection is that I was in the courtroom as a reporter covering this case for The Guardian. So a slim connection, but a connection all the same. A very potted summary. I think all of you know exactly what happened. But in 1993, you, Deborah, published Denying the Holocaust, the Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. It came out here in the UK a year later. And 2 years after that, in 1996, David Irving sued you and Penguin Books for, among other things, this is one line from a passage. Irving is one of the most dangerous spokespersons for Holocaust denial, you wrote. Familiar with historical evidence, he bends it until it conforms with his ideological leanings and political agenda. He sued, claiming this was defamatory. The case came to trial. In 2000, Irving acting for himself, the late Richard Rampton, the barrister for the defense, and a procession of scholars testified to the facts of the Holocaust in order to show that no reasonable or fair-minded historian could doubt the events of the Holocaust, and that Irving must therefore not be reasonable or fair-minded. I say this procession of scholars, there were no survivors of the Holocaust who were called to testify, and you yourself did not testify, and we're going to come back to that. Anyway, I want to go back to the day whose 25th anniversary has just passed, which was the 11th of April 2000. I was in the courtroom, very apprehensive about this judgment that we were going to get. Two of you had seen the judgment the previous day, 24 hours earlier, but you hadn't.
No.
So you didn't know, and I was, to use a very precise legal term, on spilkers at the time. What were you going through on that day?
It was not only that I hadn't seen it, but David Irving had seen it, because he was a litigant in person. So I felt like the very lonely person, you know, at the dance or something. And in fact, I had said to James before, listen, I'll call you that morning. I know you're getting it at 10 o'clock. I'll call you at 10:30. And I'm just going to say, is it sunny over there at Mishcon de Reya, or is it storming? And he said, I don't know if I'd use the term, but I'll be disbarred, you know. So, and at 9:30, they had permission to tell me. I was in a taxi on the way over to the offices. I think I called it 9:29. And Anthony said, it's not 9:30 yet. And I had I never use it, but I did use an expletive. And they told me so.
And a lot of the journalism at the time, and the book's been written, said this was history on trial, this was the Holocaust on trial. I don't want to yet get to what the judgment said. We'll hold that back in a little bit of suspense. But just tell me what you felt was at stake when you were waiting for that phone call.
Well, certainly my reputation, my decision to go ahead with the fight. There were people, historians, academics, and people, particularly here in London, who felt that it was a mistake, that we'd be giving him oxygen that he didn't deserve, and that even if we won, he would manage to pull off a victory. And there were people who were frightened, frightened that it was the wrong decision, and here come the hot-headed American, with her American supporters to do this. So that certainly was part of it. And I didn't think that if he won, the whole history of the Holocaust would be upended. But I did know that if he won, there would be people who would say, yes, the Holocaust happened, but maybe it wasn't as bad, or maybe there is something, which is what they said before. Maybe there's something to what he said. So there was a lot at stake.
You obviously got sight of it before, 24 hours before. I'm not going to ask you how nervous you were, but were you ever in the poll process? Because it obviously had been years leading up to the trial. Were you ever yourself in doubt as to whether this could be won?
So when I first got involved in this, when Deborah telephoned through to me, it was just an ordinary day for me. And I took a telephone call, and the voice said, I'm Deborah Lipstadt. Hello. I've just received a court document of some kind, I think you said, and it's been suggested that I talk to you about it, and that we talked about it. And it was really as simple as that. And at the time I thought, you said, will you act for me? And to be asked is to agree, of course. And I thought, this is a case that I mustn't lose. But then the comforting thought was, this is a case that's impossible to lose. And it was impossible to lose, because essentially what we were being asked to defend was the proposition that on a Monday, Monday is Monday. And when one says it's Monday on Monday, it's not possible for that statement to be refuted. So we kind of went forward on the basis that the stakes were very high, but victory was certain. And I think that remained, wouldn't you say, James? That remained our conviction right through to the end.
Yeah, I wish I always had the confidence that you have in things. But from very, very early on, we knew. And from the moment we engaged and we accepted the challenge and knew that we were going to litigate this to the end, we knew that we were going to win. And so and we had litigated with Irving very recently beforehand. So we had a dress rehearsrsal.
And we won that, didn't we?
I wasn't so sure.
No. Well, I want to ask about it, because when you say it was as simple in a way as saying on Monday it's Monday, the point was here, as I understand it, in this case, it was you also had to prove that he willfully, knowingly distorted the history, that he doctored the historical record.
Yeah, but that was the Monday is Monday, because as soon as we started looking at it, the falsifications just overwhelmed us in their number and obviousness.
So here's my question for you, James, which is, in the court, we were really obsessively looking at the judge, the late Charles Grey, and there would be lines of questioning that he would pursue where you'd think, he's actually been quite sympathetic now to Irving's case. He's taking it seriously and challenging the counter-argument. Did you ever have, I mean, you said in a way that you didn't quite have Anthony's confidence, but did you ever have that sense that actually maybe this is not cut and dry?
Not at that stage, but there are two dynamics that are going on then. The first of all is the normal dynamic in any case of it, the ebbs and flows, and you can sit in a courtroom and the case that you know every single detail of, and you try and read the reaction of the judge, and it's for nothing. No one, the most experienced practitioners come out of the court and say, this is what I think is happening, and you don't know.
Right.
And so at a certain point, you give up on reading judges. But the second thing is that, particularly with litigants in person, you know that the judge has to give the litigant their chance to make their case and to overextend and to overindulge the litigant in person. And so those were the dynamics that were going on. And at no point during the trial, I think we were seriously concerned about any aspect of it.
But you were a bit.
The whole time. But there's a story which we sort of skipped over. My phone call to Anthony. I got a phone call shortly after I received the papers from Mike Wine, who I think some of you probably know. And Mike knew I was being sued, and I said, yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do. He said, here's the person you should reach out to, Anthony Julius. And I said, oh, he just wrote the book on T.S. Eliot and anti-Semitism. I don't have the title exactly correct, but Anthony will correct me, on T.S. Eliot. And I know, of course I know. And Mike began to laugh at me. You can tell when you're being laughed at. And when he stopped, I said, and he also just represented Princess Diana in her divorce suit. And Mike said, Deborah, you're the only one in the world who would say, author of a book on T.S. Eliot, and also.
David, you were following this like everyone else in a way as an observer from afar. Were you hooked by it? Were you?
It's impossible to remember. I remember thinking at the time, watching it and thinking this will be a very, very bad business if they lose. I just thought this will be a terrible business if they lose. And I remember Deborah coming out of the court, but then I remember everyone coming out of the court. I remember the Guildford Four coming out of the court. I remember the Birmingham Six coming out of the court. The moment when they come out of the court is always just a fantastic moment. And I suppose because I'm always on the side of the people who are coming out of the court, I just instinctively sympathise with them. And I remember Deborah very, very clearly. That's the part I remember, is the part of Deborah coming out, and everyone just feeling a tremendous sense of relief, I think, Jonathan.
Yes.
That's I think, what someone who was not involved felt was a tremendous sense of relief, because we all knew who Irving was. Everybody knew who Irving was.
Yes, I think that's right. Let's just stay with the trial a bit, and this question, which actually is part of the film, the business of the case being heard in front of a judge rather than a jury. I want to talk about how you got to that, but why was that important?
Well, in those days, the libel cases were heard in front of juries, and it was only if the master, the kind of junior judge responsible for organising the proceedings, agreed and made an order that jurors were dispensed with. And we thought it was important to do without a jury, essentially for two reasons. First of all, we wanted a tight trial that focused on the evidence with very little grandstanding. And secondly, we wanted a full and reasoned judgment from the judge, which we wouldn't have got if there was a jury, because then the judge's summing up would simply be a series of directions to the jury, and the jury would respond with very short verdicts in favour or against the claimant. So that double objective was important to us, and the way in which we got the master to make that order was we went along to the judge and we said, this is a very complicated case. The evidence is in at least 2 languages. An ordinary jury wouldn't. Essentially, we played to Irving's vanity. An ordinary jury wouldn't understand the complexity of the arguments. It's all very sophisticated reasoning and so on and so forth. You remember, James? And I was sitting next to Irving, and I was saying these things, somewhat against the kind of the grain of my utter recoil from him saying anything which he might receive well, but
Including good morning.
including just smiling and saying, "I'm sure Mr. Irving agrees," which was not a statement I ever thought I would make, and the judge saying, "Well, okay, that's what you say, Julius. What do you say, Mr. Irving?" I think he fully expected Irving to say, "No, I want a jury," which would have been the smart, sensible thing for Irving to say. But he was so beguiled by the thought of essentially conducting a seminar with historians to the exclusion of the kind of jury riffraff. He said, "Actually, I agree. We'll do without a jury." And the judge said, looking at me, "Are you sure, Mr. Irving, that's what you want?" And Irving said, "Oh, yes, well, it's all far too sophisticated for an ordinary jury." And essentially his fate was sealed at that point, I think.
What do you think would have happened, James, if it had been in front of a jury? Would because he was quite a sort of,
Well, Anthony always thought that, with a judge, he would win. I, having investigated the case and maybe spoken personally to Charles Gray behind closed doors, I'm glad you were so sure. It would have been absolutely catastrophic if it had gone the other way. And when I spoke to Charles Gray, who is now dead, so I don't really want to say what he said or anything like that, but I don't think it was open and shut.
And what about on this point of a jury, and what difference it would have made whether his performance because he did perform, even with only a judge there. We would see him perform.
Yeah,
Do you think a judge,
I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure it was shrewd. You know, it was.
Just James, why don't you just come in on this point of how a jury might have reacted to him?
Well, who knows how a jury would have reacted to him? I think most of us found, everyone found him odious. I think a jury would have found him odious. I don't think he was attractive to a very, very particular and very, very small audience.
Who were in the courtroom.
Who were in the courtroom, but they wouldn't have sat as the jury. So I think he would have, even with the jury, dug his own grave.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have, we wouldn't have been so confident. We'd have to read 12 people's minds rather than one person's mind. And we wouldn't have, as Anthony said, have the reasoned judgment.
Which is what you wanted for posterity, partly. Yeah. David, in the film, you're partly interested in those people who don't speak, which is Holocaust survivors and Deborah. That's one of the themes in the film. Why was that of interest to you, that particular?
Well, it wasn't of interest. It was just incredibly inconvenient and very, very difficult to deal with because the classic legal drama on the Aaron Brockovich model, which is a very, very good film, I think, fantastic film, is the story of an inarticulate woman becoming articulate. This is the story of an articulate woman becoming inarticulate. And it is really, really struggling with that problem was the main, not the main, but it was one of the principal dramaturgical. And it also, if you misframed it, it was also very anti-feminist. In other words, there was a woman who could speak wonderfully on her own behalf, who was not allowed to speak on her own behalf because two men stopped her from speaking on her own behalf and took over the job from her. And so I'm not saying I disguised that side of it, but I had to make that look like a positive choice. Perhaps you should speak to this, Deborah.
It was. I have friends, and some of them are here, who thought it was because not only did I not speak at the trial, but for the 2 years preceding, Anthony and James had said to me, "Do not talk to the press," and I was being pursued by the press, and I was silent. And I have friends who considered it an unnatural act for Deborah Lipstadt to be silent. And it was very hard. It was very, very hard. It was very difficult. I remember sitting in Richard Rampton's office when I first met him, and he's someone who's very much missing here today. And he said to me, "I'm not going to call you." He had already talked to Anthony and James about this. And I said, "What?" You know, and, but this is, I'm the one on trial. I'm the one. And he said, "I'm not going to call you because he's suing you for what you wrote, and there's really nothing you can add." And then you open up a whole can of worms in what he might ask. But it was the right decision. It was the right decision, and it was also the right decision not to call survivors. And I know there were many survivors who were hurt who told me this in the days, in the months and years following the trial, and when the movie came out. But I wanted to testify. But it was, I think it was the right decision made by Anthony, James, and Richard Rampton.
So let's just hear why you made that decision. Why don't you just, we'll break into two. First of all on Deborah, and then you about survivors. Why did you think that was the right choice?
Well, with the greatest of respect to Deborah, there was nothing that she could add. She'd written the book, and we had to, the defence that we were putting forward was what she said was true. Yeah. And what could she say? She could come up and say, "It's true." But we needed to substantiate the underlying truth, how he distorted the history, that he was a polemicist, that he did it in aid of his own ideology. And that wasn't, either Deborah could rehearse her own research and say, "This is what led me to make those statements," or we could present the evidence that gave credence to what she had said. And that's what we did. And we didn't need Deborah to do it. We used the experts to do it.
And what about this decision about not having... People imagined, when they saw those headlines, Holocaust in trial, they did imagine Holocaust survivors in the witness box being grilled by David Irving. Just tell us about how you made your decision.
Well, I mean, in part for the reasons that James has just given, in part for a sort of litigation reason, which is whether you're suing or being sued, the right way to engage with the other side is by attacking. So we although we were defending, the form of our defense was not to defend the proposition that the Holocaust happened, but rather to advance the proposition that Irving was a bad historian who falsified the historical record. Now, what that meant was putting his books on trial, not the Holocaust, and the witnesses to support the proposition that he's a bad historian were the expert historians who reviewed the books. The only relevance of survivors would have been if we had defended rather than attacked the proposition that the Holocaust itself had happened. But obviously, not only would it have been an outrage to submit survivors to cross-examination by Irving, it would have been completely inconsistent with the way we were running the case.
Which was the strategy of offence, not defence.
Yes, indeed.
So we've talked about your feeling about it. Let's get then to April the 11th for everyone, the world, April the 10th for you, and how that felt to all of you in that moment, whether you expected it or whether you worried about it. Well, we have to start with you.
Great joy.
It's still hard.
I didn't expect that, you know. Verklempt, that's a fine Oxford word. It was only then that I realized what a burden I'd been carrying. And I remember, I mentioned him before I got verklempt about that too, Richard Rampton. That night I was on Jeremy Paxton's show, and James and I were doing media, but I believe Richard and his wife Carolyn went out to dinner with Robert Jan van Pelt and a couple of the others. And Robert Jan told me that...
he was one of the historian experts.
Yes, and Richard Evans is here, and you know, the work they did was tremendous, tremendous, all of them. And Richard broke down and cried. And he said that the reason he was, first of all, he knew what pain this trial had caused to survivors who were in the courtroom every day. And he had the same reaction, he and I talked about it afterwards, to be thanked by survivors of the Holocaust. I was on trial. He defended me. We all worked on a case, but to be thanked by survivors of Auschwitz for a legal battle, it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. So it just was, I'm surprised at my own emotions here, very un-British, so you'll have to forgive me. That's why they didn't want to put me on the stand. Or in the witness box. But it was a tremendous, and afterwards, and when you came to Washington, we were at the Capitol for the Yom HaShoah commemoration, and survivors just engulfed us, and thank you. And I remember one survivor from Atlanta, when I walked into the room, into the Capitol Rotunda where the Yom HaShoah commemoration was, she was on the other side, and she said, "There's our Deborah."
Deborah, a warrior for your people. I mean, this is your mention of Richard Rampton is interesting because obviously he's not Jewish, and was that part of the thinking that it was good to have an advocate in court who was not a Jew, or did that not even cross your mind, James?
Richard, I worked with Richard. I'm so happy to see Carolyn here, and I worked when I was a junior solicitor. We worked for the somewhat less estimable Robert Maxwell together. And we practically lived in each other's pocket for 3 or 4 years when we were doing all his libel work during, as I would like to regard it, Robert Maxwell's honest period. The way in which Picasso has a blue period, Maxwell had an honest period. And we were the artists of that honest period. And so when Deborah instructed us, he wasn't one of a number of people we considered. He was the only person that I considered for his intelligence, his compassion, his tremendous historical grasp, and his just readiness to throw himself into the project at hand, to pick up the necessary German, to do everything, and then beyond what was demanded of him. So that was easy. The ethnicity question didn't arise, and equally it didn't arise with the choice of his the experts that we used or anybody else. I mean, one or two people said, oh, you have to make sure that so-and-so isn't a Jew and so-and-so isn't a Jew and so on. It's just absurd anxieties speaking at that point, which we disregarded.
Yeah, there were a lot of those absurd anxieties around at the
I
time.
had an interesting experience with Richard Randall. We went to Auschwitz, and at one point I was somewhat going off topic, I guess, and telling a story or getting emotional, and Richard said, no, we have to stick to the law. And I'm thinking, I had just met him once before that. I said, oh my God, this is the man who's going to represent the case in court. And then later we stopped at the hotel where our luggage was, and he was collecting his luggage, and Carolyn, you called, or he called you, and he didn't know I was sitting adjacent, and he said, I've just come from the most terrible place on the face of the earth.
Because your story about him, your memory of him crying afterwards, cuts against the image we often have of lawyers, which is the taxi rank principle. You take a case, you do your best job, and then you move on to the next one. Just quickly, both of you, this was not just another case. You were emotionally invested in it.
Very emotionally invested in it. And like Anthony, I had read Deborah's book before. We understood the issue of Holocaust denial, and we were very invested in the outcome. And there was a huge amount of people involved in it. I see Mark and David and Morris over there, a friend of mine who sent me recently the note we'd sent to his dad about the case and the strategy of the case at the very, very beginning, when we were asking people to support us in the case. And part of the vindication, you were asking about the
just to explain, Morris's father being Ben Helfgott, survivor of the Holocaust.
And part of my reaction on the day of the judgment was seeing that the judgment itself wasn't in doubt, the outcome wasn't in doubt, the actual quality of the judgment, the detail of the judgment, we didn't know. And we were very, very pleased to see that work that we'd done over 6 years at that stage, 4 years before that at that stage, the fruits of that work coming out in that judgment in a way that we knew would be permanent and important and would stand the test of time, as it has.
I want to get on to questions of the sort of legacy of it and the aftermath, including for all of you personally. But let's talk about the film, because that is in a way what a lot of people know about this case and people who weren't in the court. It's about a decade ago now, I think, that it made that transition. David, just to you, first of all, what drew you to tell this particular story? Because there are many. But also, in a way, you had the sort of jury problem that we were hearing about, which is a very complex legal, historical set of knotty questions you had to make accessible to a wide audience. How did you approach that?
Well, a couple of American producers had been trying to make the film for some time with conventional American screenwriters, and they had come to Christine Langan, who ran the film department at the BBC, and said, you British are better at doing these things than we are. And Christine rang me and said, you are the man who does impossible subjects. I've got a really impossible subject for you that they've been trying to make for 10 years. Do you want to read the other script? I said, no, I have absolutely no wish to read any of the other scripts. I'll look at the material itself. And it presented very grave difficulties, principally the one of the silent heroine, which was one problem. But the other problem was that the subject had to be historical truth. And you cannot, Irving would be, if you cod up scenes and start misrepresenting what happened in the court or misrepresenting what happened outside the court broadly, then Irving would be perfectly entitled to say, this is a misrepresentation of history. This film had to be true, and true in a more profound sense than most films are true. And so I was faced with that dilemma, because the truth is not always very dramatic, as we know. And so I was particularly faced with 40 days of testimony, and I rapidly calculated that it took me roughly 4 or 5 hours to read one day, and I was meant to read 40 days. Mercifully, I had a wonderful associate producer called Joe Oppenheimer, who read the whole trial from beginning to end twice. And would hand bits to me saying, you need this and you need that. And this is an interesting bit, go for this bit, don't worry about that day, nothing interesting happened that day. that which lawyers accept is just the va and vient of being a lawyer, which is not so great for the movies. And that was one thing, but I also had to decide what it was about, which was a big decision, because it's not necessarily what the case is about, but the film is about historical truth. It's not about anti-Semitism. It's about, if you start saying that Auschwitz was not an extermination camp, but a labor camp, if you start saying that Hitler was at the head office while the branch manager, Himmler, went nuts in the East, but Hitler didn't know what was happening, if you start misrepresenting factual history, then this is a very, very dangerous course about everything, not just about anti-Semitism, but about everything. There is such a thing as historical truth, the film is asserting. Now, plainly, in the historical context, the film is a complete failure, in the sense that it came out around the time Trump was first elected, and now Trump is saying historically that he won an election in 2020, that all scientific, all journalistic, all records prove he lost. He stands there saying, I won this election. He didn't win the election, but he is still asserting it. And what's interesting is after 100 days, he's asserting that more, because for him, that's the battleship. That's the, just as Auschwitz was the battleship of the trial, the battleship for Trump is, if I can get people to accept such an obvious, blatant lie as this, that I won the 2020, then all else follows from that.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is what the film is about.
Yeah, I actually want to get very much into the contemporary resonance of it. Just before we do, though, two things about the film. You reminded me of a detail of an event that happened in court that didn't make it into the film.
Oh, yes.
That actually I was in court for, but I just think it's just a little point of view.
Well, in his closing statement, David Irving was standing there, and he looked up at the judge, and he meant to say, Your Lordship, and he looked at him and he said, Mein Führer. And you were in the courtroom, I remember that, because you walked out afterwards. You said, the story, the headline tomorrow will be this incident and not the closing arguments. And by the time I looked at my phone, I said, it already is. It was quite a moment to hear, I don't know, 200 people who were crammed into that courtroom.
And David said just before why you didn't include that.
Oh, I couldn't make it convincing.
And so that is what had actually happened. You got us, though, David, to where I wanted to go to with this, which is the resonance for now. Because I remember feeling afterwards and writing afterwards that my hope was that this would be the end of something. I think the timing of this is important. This trial happened in the first weeks, months of the new millennium. And there was this hope, I think, that we were sort of closing the book on a very, very bleak episode of the previous century. We had the judgment, 300 plus pages of Charles Gray saying this is what happened, and we could sort of close the book and move to a brighter future. It dawns on me now that we were perhaps at the beginning of something instead, and I think David Hare has, identified it. We're going to go. I will go wider on the issues of truth and post-truth that we're in, but just on the specific about Holocaust denial, I think some people did hope, Deborah, that it would be a fatal blow to Holocaust denial, and it hasn't quite worked out.
Well, it was a fatal blow. I divide, as some of you know, I've written this, Holocaust denial into two groups, softcore Holocaust denial and hardcore Holocaust denial. And we usually use those categories for pornography, and I do it quite advisedly because this is the pornographic history. And what it did, I think, mark the death knell to is the hardcore stuff. And that's as a result of the what I call dream team of historians that we had, led by Richard Evans and Christopher Browning, Robert Jan van Pelt, Peter Longery, Shayo Funke, who followed the footnotes back to the sources and showed that this man, and I'm going to paraphrase you, Richard, here, that in virtually every case you looked at, there was some sort of invention, distortion, exaggeration, reversal of dates, and it was tedious work, it was long work, but it amassed. No one had ever done this before. No historian ever. We all said this is garbage. This is not true. But no one ever thought it was worth their while, and wasn't worth their while, to prove, that this guy was lying, because it was so obvious that he was lying. But now we had a historical record, beginning with his work on Dresden, so even before his actual denial, that the man, as Richard Rampton said in his opening statement, it's not that he's a bad historian, he's a liar. And that body of material now exists. It exists in the 5 or 6 books that came out around the trial. It exists in the website h.org, run by put up by my university. There is a body of material which proves, I'll take one example from Robert Jan. We found a document which lists, and this is horrific information, the capacity of the various crematoria at Auschwitz, how many bodies they could burn in a day. And this list, and you can go online and see it. Why was this important? Because the Germans had a deathly fear of typhus and didn't want dead bodies lying around. So the killing process was based on how many bodies you could burn in one day, so you wouldn't have dead bodies there. And that depended then how many people you deported and how many people you chose at the selection site. So, it's horrific material, and it's just one example. And how he lied about Dresden, how he long before he became a denier. That this body of material now exists, and unbelievably, without any doubt, shows that what kind of liar these people are. So that form of denial is, yes, it's engaged in by some people, and some of those people get onto Piers Morgan, or they get onto Joe Rogan and things like that. But they're outliers, and they will have their followers. What hasn't gone away, and what of course has a greater resonance today, is the softcore denial. Here's the Holocaust again, or rolling the eyes. Or I was interviewed by BBC4 on the program for their Sunday program this past week, and the whole thing of the interviewer, I wasn't surprised it was the BBC after all, was isn't it time to stop with these memorials because they've gotten rote? And I said, no, you don't stop. It's that diminution of, the Holocaust again. And that's much harder. That's sort of whack-a-mole, because it's harder to fight. It's squishier. But the hardcore, the historical record now exists, that people cannot say, well, maybe, of course there was a Holocaust, but maybe David Irving had a point, or maybe it wasn't, 6 million or whatever, but it's there.
And so then, or rather looking back on it now, there seems something almost quaint about the idea that a matter of truth could be settled in a courtroom with a definitive judgment, and that would be a sort of, as it were, to close the book on something. Now, in an era of social media and proliferating platforms, etc., it just feels as if it's a runaway train. Is there nevertheless a role for law in these sorts of, in the battles that David Hare was describing about truth?
Well, first of all, the trial resettled the question. It didn't settle it, because the question had already been settled many times over. And that it resettled it was a necessary act for all the reasons that's been given. But the idea that truth, in some sense, can achieve some settled position, which then puts it beyond further challenge or attempted discredit, is a kind of fantasy. Better, I think, to understand these battles as necessarily fought in every generation, where the victories are always critical, but never more than provisional. So we fight in order to survive, to fight the next time.
Right. In other words, nothing is ever over.
No, only defeats are permanent. Victories are only ever provisional. And this is the asymmetrical nature of the fight with anti-Semites, and then more broadly, the fight, to put it, I hope in not too ponderous or pompous language, the civilization against barbarism.
Just because David made a point of saying the film wasn't about anti-Semitism, about historical truth. I just do want to ask you about anti-Semitism, though, James, because I think there were some hopes. It was the turn of the new century, as I said, that maybe this was something of the past rather than the future. I don't know if you harboured those hopes for the case, but just because you're involved in this work now about anti-Semitism in our world now.
Yeah, I think if there were hopes, and maybe there were hopes, they were dispelled pretty quickly, and it was the end of something. It absolutely was the end. Irving was the end of a form of anti-Semitism, a representative of anti-Semitism, particularly in this country, on the far right. But we were then fighting other battles very quickly after that. Islamist anti-Semitism was the first one we looked at, the far left anti-Semitism that we've been fighting since then. And so I think the hopes were pretty short-lived, if there were hopes.
And David, just to close with you, at this point about David Irving seemed a kind of a niche figure, really, almost an eccentric figure then. I know you made your point about the American president, but I want you to just go wider about the culture. Do you feel that sort of culture of fake news, of making claims that are not backed up by fact, do you see that around, putting aside the American president?
Well, clearly, there are people who believe they can get away with lies. I think two things about the trial. One, that I think, as someone who looked at it completely, however many years later, I think Anthony and Richard and James and Heather, who is no longer alive, underestimate the degree to which their skill made a huge difference. It was something that might have gone disastrously wrong and could have gone disastrously wrong and didn't go disastrously wrong. I don't share your faith in the law, and I think their skill was absolutely decisive. On the other hand, I also think that obviously for Deborah the thing was a huge success, but it wasn't a success as much as a disaster averted. That's what I felt. I just felt that if these people here had fumbled the case and it had not been won, it would have been a major catastrophe, I think. And that's what I feel. It's a disaster averted, not a lasting triumph. It can't be.
No. Well, that's a convergence that's very helpful. And we've only got about 10 minutes left. I think we'll try and take a few questions from all of you here. More or less everyone in this room I can see has got a very direct connection with this set of issues. So why don't a hand or two go up and we'll see how many we can get in. I can see a hand over there and one over there. Why don't we take a microphone in each direction and we'll take both. And then I definitely want to hear from Professor Evans. So we'll, you go first and then we'll bring the microphone to Professor Evans. Yeah.
David Irving clearly had a lot at stake, including his reputation. What was he thinking? Why did he think he had any chance of succeeding in this case?
Great, thank you. And then, let's pass your microphone 2 or 3 rows in front to Richard Evans there. And while we're doing that, let's hear from Daniel. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Just a scene in the film which was very dramatic, is when there's a sort of shadowy group of senior Anglo-Jewish figures who are really strongly recommending not to go ahead with this and casting aspersions on the lawyers involved. I mean, was that overstated in the film, or was that really a source of pressure that had come to the law firm?
Okay, we'll have that. And then this is a key player in the case, Professor Sir Richard Evans.
And a hero.
Thanks very much. I mean, I could say an awful lot, but I just want to, it's not really a question. I do have a question at the end, but this is about the fact that Irving addressed the judge as mein Führer, and in his closing statement. And curiously, I was there. I was phoned up a few days later by a psychiatrist who was writing a book about Freudian slips.
Oh, wow.
And he said, did Irving actually say that? And I said, well, I can hardly believe it, but yeah, I heard him say it. What's your explanation? And the psychiatrist said, well, in his childhood, Irving bitterly resented the fact his father went away to the war in the Navy. And in fact, his brother recalls him rushing out to the back garden in Essex and giving Nazi salutes to German bombers coming over to bomb London. And he identified completely with Hitler. And for Irving, Hitler was a benign authority figure. As was mentioned earlier on in the discussion, the judge, Charles Gray, bent over backwards to be nice to Irving because he did not want Irving to appeal on the grounds that he'd been disadvantaged as a litigant in person. So for Irving, the judge was a benign authority figure, and in the excitement of delivering his closing speech, he confused the two. And the judge, Charles Gray, was unusually forthcoming for a judge, and the psychiatrist had phoned him up too. And asked him, did he say that? And the judge said, while everyone was falling about laughing, he said that that Irving had mumbled an apology to him. Of course, on Irving's website, all this has been altered by changing the punctuation and so on. But so that's one thing I just wanted to point out. Allow us to be professorially pedantic and point out that the year 2000 was the last year of the 20th century. And if you don't, which in a way is more suitable. So if you, it's your argument. So if you don't believe me, just work it out. And then I want to ask David a question, because you came to see me and we had a couple of hours conversation about the trial. And as you left my office, you said rather cryptically, well, everyone you'd interviewed had a different story to tell. And I'd seen it in a different way. And I thought, oh, this movie is going to be another Rashomon, you know, but it wasn't. You told it very straight. Is that according with your memory? And if you change your mind, why did you change your mind?
Very, very good. And that's the Freudian slip story is marvelous. And to be corrected by Professor Sir Richard Evans is a badge of honor. And I'm very, very glad to wear it. Why don't we just start on why did he think he could win? Let's have that for you.
So the Irving tactic was every time there was a critical or disparaging statement made about him in the press, he would sue, but then he would be super reasonable in reaching a settlement. And he became well known as a figure in the libel world as somebody who always sued and always was ready to settle on very cheap terms. And I think he fully expected that strategy to work in Deborah's case.
And he tried it, didn't he?
And he tried it, and I think what took him aback, but by then it was too late certainly for someone like Irving to back down. It was too late for him to change his strategy when he was confronted on this occasion by somebody who would not back down.
I think there's something else as well, which is he's a sociopath, and he believed things that he started off not believing and knowing to be rubbish. And so and you could see that live in the court. He would be asked a question in exchanges with Richard, for example, when he was asking Richard the questions, and Richard would put back to him a mistranslation. And he knew that it was a mistranslation. He was a very proficient German speaker. And then he would characterize that mistranslation, and that characterization would be the truth. Even though at the moment that he said it, he knew it was a lie. The moment later, it was the truth. And for someone like that, they can believe they're going to win when all of the evidence is that they're not going to win.
And nobody had ever called him to account before. Right. He got away with these things. He said these things. He offered the settlement, I think he offered was £500. It took him about a nanosecond to say no. But no one had...
To be clear, you would have had to pay £500 to a charity he'd nominated.
That's right, that's right. That alone, a charity he nominated, I mean, you know, I could see it, Ku Klux Klan or something, I don't know. But no one had ever challenged him and called him to account, and that's what happened here.
So when we had our second question about the Anglo-Jewish figures who didn't want the case to go ahead, as depicted in the film, and the questioner asked if that was based on fact, and you interjected. So what was your response?
Well, you know, I don't want to sit here in the heart of London and so many people from the British Jewish community, but there was fear. There was fear and there was concern, and people were afraid. And there was a concern that even if he lost, he would win the publicity battle, he would get oxygen. And I think there was also a sense that these were the Americans coming over, you know, here come the cowboys, to act in a way that British Jewry doesn't act. And it was more of a shashtil, and they kept saying settle, and I kept, you know, thinking, what should be my bottom line? 2 million Jews, 3 million Jews, 2 gas chambers. You can't settle. There's certain things you cannot, and that was so clear to me. And the more I was pushed, the more I knew I couldn't do it. And I think there was a concern about Anthony. You know, had he Svengali this American woman into, you know, believing this or whatever. And people came around, but it was out of fear. I don't want to disparage in that sense. It was out of fear, it was out of concern, and it was a different way of approaching things.
And did you get some of that? Did you hear some of that, Anthony, at the time?
Yes. Yes. The next question, did you pay attention to it? No.
But if Deborah's right that it was sort of exceptional, it was not really the way British Jews had done things, it was more an American approach to go on the offensive like that, how come you didn't listen to it?
Well, first of all, it wasn't my decision to make, it was Deborah's decision. I wasn't running the case, I was acting for the person who was fighting the case. But I think when we talked about it, there wasn't any disagreement between us, that it was unconscionable, the thought that Deborah would apologize to Irving for having misrepresented him. So it wasn't really an option. I think we understood that some anxieties that the outcome couldn't be taken for granted, Irving would be given a platform and all the rest of it, but there was a complete disconnection between those anxieties and what was then being urged on us, which was that we should settle. And what was not understood was that disconnection.
Professor Evans asked a question for you, David Hare, about this remark you made to him that you were getting different accounts from everyone.
That's the fun of it. I mean, the fun of researching a subject is that everybody tells you something subtly different and gives you a different view of it. The only person I didn't speak to was David Irving, and I felt that was partly I just didn't want to meet David Irving very much, and I also felt that everything that David Irving said had to be something on the record. I had a very combative, hilarious conversation with Anthony when I first met him, quite intimidating.
Really?
Where Anthony said, "Oh, Anthony said, just Anthony said, just make it up, what Irving, you know, it doesn't matter, it's fiction, everyone goes to Shakespeare, they know Henry V never really said the things he said, and, you know, it's fiction, everyone understands fiction, you make it up. And that's the fun of fiction, right? I paraphrase your argument, Anthony. And I kind of said, I just don't feel I can do that with David Irving, and I don't think, and so David Irving only says things that are on the record in the movie. He doesn't say anything that isn't validated and testified to and people heard it and it's said. And I also don't speculate. And in that way, I land Timothy Spall with this very, very difficult problem of how to play somebody who I'm giving absolutely no psychological, you know, Richard knows a lot more about David Irving than I do and about his childhood, and I'd read all that stuff, but I really wanted to keep that out of the film. I didn't want to, as it were, have the film psychoanalyze David Irving, and so I simply presented what was on the record about Irving.
You can hear from the chimes that we are basically out of time. And really I'm going to ask you to do this in a sentence, but the point about this is it was 25 years ago, but it lives now, it has resonance for now. Well, I'm going to let you have the last word, but why don't we just say, if you can, what you feel is the thing that is sort of urgent for society today, that if they draw a lesson from this case, this whole episode, that they should take, starting with you, Anthony.
Only that when fight is offered, one should give fight in response.
Very good. David Hare?
I think it's what I've said about, I think that lying is now a political tactic and a political strategy in large parts of the world. I've singled out America, but there are all sorts of people. Some people are doing it successfully. Some, you know, if Liz Truss gets up and says, well, you know, I didn't mishandle the economy, it was entirely other people's fault, then mercifully she's laughed out of court. But she's going to go on saying it, and nothing's going to stop her saying it, and nothing will deter the people who are going to persist in lies. And something convinces them that they're allowed to do it. And what that is slightly mystifies me.
James?
Well, I just make Anthony's comment even more specific. That you know, our community has felt that it's under attack for the last 18 months, and the answer has been to fight and fight the battles, choose the battles, but fight the battles and do it bravely. And it doesn't always work, but it works enough times.
I mean, just to follow up on that, do you think in a way that attitude partly came out of the experience of this trial, that the British Jewish community somehow developed a new instinct about these things?
I think the British Jewish community developed. I think it's unfair to characterise the British Jewish community as unbrave and as avoiding the fights. I think we've done it in a different way. Our experience is different from the American community, and therefore we've been tested in different ways. But I think the resilience in the community is greater than it was, and the capacity and the willingness to fight is greater than it was.
Deborah, we've had a whole discussion here over this hour, over this extraordinary episode, all the calculations and decisions that had to be made, and the resonances for now, but you were always at the centre of it, even if, as David said, you had to be a silent heroine. Why don't you give us the closing?
It changed my life. I might have been nominated by the President of the United States to this position. I might not have been, but I had the privilege of fighting the good fight. So it's a tough battle. I don't know what's wrong with me, but not usually like this. But in any case, it's a battle. The battle against anti-Semitism is not just for the Jews and to protect the Jews, but it's a battle for democracy. It's a battle for rule of law. It's a battle for international security and stability. It's a battle for, dare I say it, society at large, civilization at large. I was in conversation a few months ago with Manuel Valls, the former premier of France, who was then when Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Cacher, and he made a classic statement, which I'm sure many of you remember. When so many French Jews were thinking of leaving France, he said, "France without Jews will not be France." And he had already said to the Jews, stay here, we'll protect you. This was not about protecting. He was saying the warp and the woof, the fabric of society will be different if one group in your community doesn't feel safe. And we live James said it a moment ago, under pressure, wherever we may live. And there's a sense of this virus, this recurring virus that mutates, having come back. And the fact that I was able to play a small part in fighting it for the past 3 years was the privilege of a lifetime.
I'm sure you are all going to want to join me in thanking Deborah Lipstadt, Anthony Julius, James Libson, David Hare. Thank you.